Hi. Sorry for the technical delays there. My name is Nate Heasley, and I run an organization called Goodnick, which is a resource group for social entrepreneurs. And we do a couple of different programs to support social entrepreneurs and social impact organizations, especially in New York City. But our latest endeavor, which is to promote social responsibility in the private sector, is an endeavor called the G-Corp model. And it's a legal framework for socially responsible technology companies. I'm really glad that I was able to follow Tim, because I think Tim really highlighted some of the issues that we're talking about, and the idea is especially of making applications safe for the users, and that's really what the G-Corp standard is about. It's about applying levels of social responsibility, including measures of social responsibility, into the technology companies, the structure of their business, so that users can know that they're safe in that environment, and to make those companies more socially responsible in overall, both within their companies, inside their doors, within the world at large, and beyond. And so the G-Corp standard is really about presenting a standard for corporate social responsibility that's tailored to technology companies. And this allows them to essentially display their social responsibility on their sleeve, to tell the world exactly in what way they're socially responsible, and to provide that feedback specifically for their users, their customers, their partners, anyone who might want to do business with them, as well as providing an example for other companies in the technology space so that they can follow their lead. And that's really what the G-Corp standard is about. So what exactly is in this idea of a G-Corp standard? The first thing that we need to remember is that when we're talking about technology companies, we're talking about companies first, right? So these are average companies that have to deal with all kinds of issues, and any standard that's applicable to technology companies should include the basic provisions of any social responsibility standard. And I want to sort of cover those first. I think this is particularly important in the technology sphere when we're talking about equality, anti-harassment, gender rights, commitment to pay equity, to pay benefits, domestic partner benefits, family leave. All of those kinds of equality, anti-harassment policies are things that the technology sector has struggled with. And we see issues every day, from the underrepresentation of women and minorities in technology companies, especially when it comes to the funding of those companies. So at a VC level, making sure that those companies are getting the cash that they need to get off the ground and be as successful as any company led by your average white male. And I think also we see echoes of that in situations like, how many people are familiar with Gamergate? It's a very hot topic these days, in part because a lot of companies do not actually have these kinds of policies in place and haven't thought about what it means to have an active anti-harassment or equality standard in place for their own company. So when we talk about CSR standards and the idea of a Goodnick company or a G-Corp model, we have to include these basic provisions with respect to equality, gender equality, equity in pay, and those sorts of factors. The other thing that we need to think about is the so-called, second bottom line, the environmental aspect of most businesses. And again, we're coming from a point where most early stage technology companies and even larger stage technology companies are largely about people sitting in the same room typing on laptops. But we can't ignore that there are environmental concerns or other health concerns that come with these kinds of activities. And any CSR policy that is adopted by technology companies needs to include these things. And that includes everything from policies around recycling, policies around sourcing of power, sourcing of materials, making sure that those materials are sourced in an environmentally friendly way, sourced in a way that is sustainable, and as often as possible is sourced locally. We also have increasing health issues, and there's this whole maker movement nowadays, which is getting more into the physical space. We used to think of technology companies as apps and .coms, and now we're really seeing a move toward physical production and things being produced, which brings with it a whole nother set of standards in terms of labor laws, and I'll get into that a little bit more in a minute. But also things like exposure to chemicals, using even a 3D printer in an enclosed space can have some deleterious health effects. So these kinds of provisions need to be included in any CSR policy related to technology companies as well, to make sure that even at a small stage, technology companies are aware of these kinds of issues and making sure that they stay ahead of them and don't fall into a trap without having thought about them, of exposing their workers to some kind of caustic chemical or unhealthful environment, as well as sort of keeping in standards of environmental and green sourcing of energy and green sourcing of products and local sourcing. The next sort of general category of social responsibility that any technology company needs to adopt is one of the financial aspects of their company. Again, we come back to issues of pay equity, so making sure that everybody at the company who is doing the same job is getting paid the same amount. But we also come into issues of pay disparity. So how much more does the person at the top make than the person at the bottom? And a standard, a sort of emerging standard for that disparity is 17 to 1, 19 to 1, 20 to 1, where the CEO or top income earner at a company is paid 20 times more than the person who's the lowest paid employee at the company. And that sounds like a huge amount of money, but there are very few companies that are willing to commit even to that standard, much less the sort of what happens in the real corporate world or the big corporate world of 100 to 1, 1,000 to 1, where CEOs are paid ridiculously and the lower workers are not. All of that contributes to the 1% problem, right? How do we make sure that the people in the 99%, the lower income bracket that makes up most of the United States, is paid a living wage and that they're fairly treated within this context of this company. There are other, obviously, wage considerations that need to be included in a CSR policy. Fair wages, living wages, paying for interns. Again, this is something that technology companies, particularly last summer, were really sort of called out on the carpet about, because there was a tendency, especially in the technology companies, to not pay interns and to really encourage the abuse of that relationship. And this has a couple of problems. First of all, interns don't get paid, they don't eat very well. And I think we can all probably attest to that at some point in our life. But also, it only contributes to the idea of the 99% versus the 1% and issues of equality and gender equality and racial equality in these companies, because people who are not from the higher income brackets often cannot afford to take the unpaid internships, which means that they then do not go on to get the great jobs, don't get funded by VCs, and it only perpetuates that cycle of inequality. So these are financial considerations that companies need to include within their social responsibility policy. So moving on to some of the more technology-specific things that need to be in a social responsibility policy. Privacy and security are probably two of the biggest issues right now and probably always will be. But right now in the technology world, these are two major issues. So any company that's committing to being socially responsible needs to be up to standards and be clear about what those standards are when it comes to privacy and security. And there are multiple standards that are out there. There are initiatives by the White House, the FTC, around privacy. The 2012 guidelines were a start in that direction. Certainly, companies can do more, and a social responsibility policy should do more. Security, you have the ISO 27001 standard, which is a standard for security. Every company that's starting out or running right now under, running some kind of technology should be meeting those standards and be transparent about what those standards are that they're meeting so that their users know that their data is secure within the system. The next category that technology companies need to consider is not being a patent troll. And this is another area that has sort of gotten some momentum in the last year or year and a half, where companies are essentially adopting a stance of saying, we as corporate citizens will not be patent trolls. We will not use our patents offensively. We will use them defensively if we need to, but otherwise we are not going to burden someone with spurious litigation simply because they're a competitor in the space. If our patents are overbroad or we could be using them in this way to disrupt our competitors, we're choosing not to and putting that out in the spirit of cooperation and competition instead of saying that we're going to undermine the business and slow technology's innovation level by using these patents in an aggressive or offensive way. So making sure that companies adopt a stance of not being in the place of being a patent troll is an important component, I think. Not every company is going to be able to do that, but to the extent that it's possible, I think most companies should commit to not engaging that kind of behavior. The other thing, which I think Tim talked a lot about, was the issue of free speech. Now, Tim talked a lot about that in the context of the service providers, right? The tubes, the Time Warner, all of those sort of service providers that actually provide the carrier level. But when we're talking about the content level, this is really important as well. So we're talking about the Facebooks and the YouTubes, and we're talking about any company, whether that's any kind of bulletin board system or any place where you might put your own photos or information about yourself, a social network or other platform like that. These platforms and these companies need to include provisions within their social responsibility policy that stand up for the principles of free speech, that protect people's ability to post what they want to post, to have the right of free speech in that platform, to have the right of association, the right of non-discrimination, the right to not be removed from the platform without some level of due diligence. And it's fairly common to see platforms ban users sort of without any cause or without substantial cause. But a good corporate citizen will have in place a policy that details the procedures by which a user could be banned or removed from the system. And there are more issues related to that I'll get into. On the pushback side a little bit on the free speech, also important that companies include anti-hate speech and anti-harassment policies within their social responsibility platform. Again, this comes back to issues of harassment on a really hateful level. And we need to remember that free speech doesn't mean all speech, that there are reasonable limitations within that context of anti-harassment, anti-death threat, those kinds of speech are not protected. And companies should recognize that and build that into their social responsibility policy. Coming back to the issue of what happens when a user gets removed or what happens when a user decides to remove themselves from the system. Social responsibility policies by companies need to include provisions for data portability. So a user needs to be able to take their data with them and, if necessary, close the account and delete all related information that's in the system on them. That's a fundamental standard that I think that all companies should adopt, and I think we've all had an experience where we'd like to remove something or everything from Facebook or some other social network, but because of the usage policies and because of the procedures that are involved, it's almost impossible, if not impossible, to actually do that. And companies need to have these procedures in place to allow a user to do that and to remove themselves from the system, take their user data with them. If they've uploaded photos, if they've uploaded personal information, all of that needs to be easily taken down and taken with the user and not locked into the system. There's also, in this context of data portability, there's also an important aspect of the right to be forgotten, right? The right to disappear from the system, which we're seeing a rise of in Europe now, as the courts have ruled that people do have a right to be forgotten, which is causing some issues and probably rightfully so. But it's an important part of any social responsibility code that users need to be able to be removed. Another important aspect of this genre of social responsibility rights is the respect for open source, right? And the respect for open standards. So to the extent that it's practicable, good corporate citizens in the technology sphere will use common open standards for all of their data. And that includes everything from how photos are encrypted, how files are stored, access to APIs, interfaces, hardware. All of those things should be moving in the direction of open standards so that it provides the most level of data portability, the most level of interface accessibility, so that ultimately it drives innovation as well as social responsibility. Another important part of the social responsibility code is transparency. This is my slide for transparency. It's pretty clever. So how does a company set itself up to be transparent? They need to make sure that they're disclosing the use or the sale of their user data, and being very clear with users about how they're doing that, using whether that's personal data, photos, face tagging, GPS data. How many people here have an iPhone? Yeah. So I was on my phone the other day and a little message popped up that said, by the way, Yelp is tracking your GPS location even when you're not using it. Do you want this to happen? And I said, no, I don't. But that's the kind of thing that's become, it permeates now all layers of technology that we interface with. And a socially responsible company will not use that data, or if they do, will be transparent about that with the user. If that is necessary for Yelp in order to somehow provide the best restaurant dining experience that I can have, and they are clear with me about that, then I'm fine allowing them the use of that data. But without that level of disclosure, I'm not happy with the tracking. The other layer of transparency is that companies need to be disclosing as much as possible about any inquiry that they get from any government agency, foreign or domestic, about your data or about users' data in general. And we've seen some of this happen. Google has been better about this. I think even Facebook and Apple have done more of this in the last year, reporting the number of requests that they get about user data, number of subpoenas that they get. All of those sorts of numbers and all of that sort of information, to the extent that it's allowed under law, and keep in mind that under some of these laws, even disclosure is not allowed. But to the extent that it's possible under law, these companies should be disclosing all of that information in a regular way, whether that's quarterly or at least in an annual report, and what they're doing to comply and how they do not give data out without a subpoena, without a proper legal request, without that level of legal inquiry. Because that is the kind of protection that a consumer needs in order to trust that company with the data. So what does all of this end up looking like? What's the end product, the deliverable on all of these standards that I've been talking about? The idea is that we have a certification mark, a specific code of conduct that we publish that is open source, which means that any company can take that code of conduct and adopt it in whole or in part. They can edit it if they want to. But if they want to use the mark, if they want to be certified as a G-Corp, or whatever we end up calling it, that they agree to those central provisions that I've just talked about, that they agree basic human rights, freedom of speech, freedom of association, transparency, protecting the environment, protecting workers' health, equity, equality, all of those things are included in the basic level of standard. And that they then are adopting that standard in whole if they want the certification mark. If they also want to get the certification mark, they would need to go through some level of reporting or auditing that would essentially ensure that they're complying with that standard. So they would have to disclose all of their information, things like the salary ratio or the number of women or minorities who work at a company. Those kinds of data should be available in an annual report at the very least. In addition to those basic criteria, the G-Corp standard will also allow for optional provisions in a manner similar to how Creative Commons licenses now are available in a variety of different flavors. The G-Corp standard will be available in a variety of different standards. So in addition to the basic level of corporate responsibility code, companies will be able to opt into other provisions. So in this case, they agree not to be patent trolls. That, again, may not be something that every company can do, but that could be a separate additional obligation that a company undertakes to be a good corporate citizen. That they agree, for instance, to provide all of their own code for open source, not just respect the open source code rights of others. That they agree not to sell data, or that they agree to anonymize data and provide extra layers of security around that. And finally, the idea that they would provide a corporate last will and testament. If corporations are people too, it makes sense that corporations should have a last will and testament. And that means having a plan in place when a company dies, when a company goes bankrupt. What happens to the user's data? Is a user given a certain amount of notice? Is a user given a certain amount of time to withdraw their data from the system, or the expected sale of that data to a third party who might be picking up the pieces after a bankruptcy? So having that corporate last will and testament in place is an essential feature of that as well. Essentially to know that these rights that you're agreeing to as a consumer, as a customer, these company protections that they've put in place are carried on not just while that company is in business, but essentially beyond the grave, and that your data will be protected going forward. So that is an overview of the Goodnick G-Corp standard, social responsibility. Right now, we're in the midst of finalizing what that looks like and what that form that will take in terms of the core commitments for social responsibility, as well as the optional commitments that I detailed with those badges that you saw. We are going to be opening that document up for public comment to a variety of different internet-related membership bodies. So the Internet Society and others will have an opportunity to comment and contribute to any of the standards that they think need to be adjusted before we finalize what that actual standard is going to be. So I hope that all of you will keep an eye out for the emerging G-Corp standard, and that you're going to help me refine it through your comments and hopefully push that it be adopted by companies that you interact with, whether that's Facebook or early stage companies that you're involved with, or just companies that you know need to be good corporate citizens. So thank you. Do we have any questions? Question or two? Yeah. Let me just.
Yeah, I have two questions. One, what does this look like in terms of the feasibility in your mind for really small startups? Like, my team is 10 people, we're profitable. Can we afford to be a Goodnick or a G-Corp? The second one is there, are there things that we can learn from LEED certification, which is something that is kind of costly in theory, but then in practice, there's a lot of benefits from it, and that kicks back down the line.
Yeah, I think both excellent questions. So the G-Corp standard is designed really for early stage companies to be able to adopt it in a very low cost way. That's the whole idea behind having it be an open source document, effectively Creative Commons licensed document, that allows people to say, we adopt this standard, or we adopt certain provisions of this. This is what we can do today. This is what we hope to do tomorrow. And if we want to end up being fully certified as Goodnick companies, we will go down that path when we're able to. And I'm not envisioning that this is a lengthy or costly process, and it's really streamlined to allow early stage companies to adopt it very easily. As for, I think what you're referring to is once you go through those procedures, or once you go through the process of actually adopting some of these standards, is there an upside? And I think that ultimately that is the goal, right? To be able to say, both from a customer standpoint, from a business partner standpoint, from an investor standpoint, that all of these things that you're adopting allow you to be a good corporate citizen, but also communicate that to the world and let other partners know that you want to be a good corporate citizen, that you're more willing to do business with other good corporate citizens. And so that ultimately results in an upside to any company that adopts the standard, as long as they're wearing their sort of G-Corp status on the sleeve. They're essentially presenting themselves to the world, to their customers, and their investors and their business partners as trustworthy. And that is the coin of the realm when it comes to the internet. Woman in the back, woman, yeah, sorry.
I don't know, you can probably hear me. I'm Dana, and this is very interesting, and I have so many things to talk about, but let me pick one simple one. When you were talking about transparency, and you got that notice from Yelp, well, if you read the 65,000 pages that you agree to, that's in there. Mm-hmm. And Waze, which we all love to use when we're driving around, and tells us what the bus route is, they actually say in there, you authorize us to look at your contacts, to read your messages, all this kind of stuff. So it's there. It's just that it's long after all the stuff where they want you to not steal their software. I mean, the stuff they have in there is legitimate. So I understand the point, and I completely support it. But it is very hard because there's so many things that they might want to communicate, and how do you separate that out in a way that we can all say, no, I choose not to load Waze on my phone because I don't want you to have access to these other things.
Well, so a certain level of sort of self-initiative is required, right? We need to protect our own data all the time, everywhere. We need to go through our phone settings on a regular basis and make sure that our privacy settings are at the maximum, that our apps don't have access to contacts if we don't want them to. All of that is important that we do on our own. The idea behind the G-Corp standard is really to let companies adopt some kind of public, easily communicated public stance on some of these issues, right? And say, we agree in whole to this sort of core set of principles, that we are going to be transparent about our use of data. We're going to be clear about our non-sale of it. All of these things we are going to adopt, and so that when you're there on the website or looking at the app in the About section, you can see that that person has adopted, or that company has adopted, the standard that you agree with in whole. And then hopefully with the use of things like iconography, some of those ideas are more easily communicated than just through a 65,000 word user.
Right, so that you, for example, on the app, you'd have something like privacy, and you would have a little yellow or orange or even a red thing, which means your data is not going to be private, and things like, et cetera.
And this comes back, I think, to what Tim was talking about, I'm sorry, I forgot the name of the project, the woman who's doing the
index?
Index, yeah. So that sort of an index would dovetail nicely with something like this, right? So you can see, okay, this company, and there are already apps that you can install on your browsers to block invasive cookies, to provide little red, yellow, or green warning lights as you visit sites. All of those things can be layered on as well. I think the idea behind the G-Corp standard is really about saying these are some common principles that are not such that we don't want to bury, that we're going to adopt as a standard across the industry for companies that are good corporate citizens in the technology space. And that way this is the standard for good companies. And if you're not on this, then you're probably at least a yellow, if not a red.
I just wanted to make a comment. You mentioned about the privacy settings and the permissions that apps get, and then you also touched upon it as well. I wanted to say that if you don't want to pay the Apple tax and actually switch to Android, there's a rooted app called X-Privacy that allows you to restrict every single component of what the app has access to for your information. So I actually use it. It's called X-Privacy. You need it for Android. If anyone wants help with it, I can help them with it later. And the list of 40 things that Facebook has access to becomes 3 when you use that app. So if anyone who would like to actionably prevent these apps from encroaching upon your security, I'd be happy to help you with that.
So is there one more question? Sorry, did you have a question? Sure. Okay.
I'm allowed to ask a question.
Okay, you're the you use the convener's privilege.
That's microphone's on. Yeah. Okay, we'll start out with a real fast legalistic question. Are you envisioning the G-Corp standard being something that would be embedded in the corporate bylaws of a corporation, or
Yeah, at its highest level, something that's embeddable in a legally enforceable way
Yeah.
would be critical. It's up to the company to decide how they would adopt that. So it could be simply posting the standard on their website and saying this is what we agreed to, or this is what we do. Is the sort of light touch, not necessarily trustworthy way of doing it. Incorporating it into the bylaws would be necessary for something like certification.
Right. So with the bylaws, then shareholders could actually sue if those, standards were not enforced.
Yeah. So there would be some legal enforcement mechanisms
Right.
and some reporting requirements that would be included in something like an annual report, which would have a legally binding effect.
Yeah. Okay, now a quick plug here. I'm allowed to do this as a convener. I'm interested, Jonathan, I think, just stepped out of the room, but having his BLIP project assist us in creating a new corporate entity to cover all the ground that the Internet Society isn't able to with their bylaws, both on the infrastructure side and at the higher application level with new network-connected technologies, promoting openness and ethical standards. So. Okay, next.